The prison walls felt like a cage, but to Marco, they were just the beginning of a larger, far more dangerous game. He had been playing this game for years, moving in the shadows, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now that moment had arrived. Marco wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He didn't need to. He was a strategist, a mastermind who knew that power didn't just come from strength, but from control. Control over people, over information, over timing. And for him, El Patron's empire was nothing more than a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right spark to detonate it. What El Patron didn't realize was that Marco had been playing him from the inside out. For months, Marco had carefully planted seeds, small acts of sabotage, tiny bits of information, allies who would one day turn on their leader. It wasn't a matter of if El Patron would fall. It was a matter of when. But Marco didn't want a messy takeover. No, his plan was surgical, precise, and it was going to be devastating. The world would watch as the mighty empire of El Patron, the man who had made everyone tremble with fear, crumbled from within. And Marco would be there, at the center of it all, pulling the strings. The question wasn't whether El Patron would be taken down. It was who would stand in his place. Marco had spent years building his network, and now the pieces were aligning. His plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. Marco knew the risks. He had spent years calculating every move, studying every weakness in El Patron's empire. But now, as he stood in the dimly lit room with only a few trusted allies by his side, the stakes were higher than ever. One wrong step, and it would all come crashing down. But there was no turning back. The plan was set, and the clock was ticking. Marco was in control of every detail. His network of informants was vast, stretching from the lowest levels of the cartel to the highest echelons of government. But this was different. El Patron had begun to show cracks. He was slipping, and Marco could feel it in the air. The longer he waited, the more dangerous the situation became. And then it hit him. El Patron's greatest weakness wasn't his enemies, nor his rival cartels. It was the very people he trusted the most. Those closest to him were the ones who had the power to bring him down. Marco knew it was time to strike, and strike fast. A series of covert meetings, coded messages, and carefully orchestrated betrayals would set the wheels in motion. But Marco wasn't about to make the same mistake that so many had made before him. He wouldn't rely on brute force. He would use their trust against them, like a puppet master pulling the strings from the shadows. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of what was about to unfold hanging in the air. But Marco's expression was cold, calculating. He wasn't nervous. He was confident. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Marco watched the city skyline from the penthouse, his mind racing. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets below as the weight of his decision began to settle in. He had taken the first step. He had started the chain reaction that could either bring El Patron to his knees or lead him straight into the crosshairs of a dangerous war. His phone buzzed, the alert flashing on the screen. The hit's been confirmed. Tomorrow night. It's now or never. Marco's heart rate quickened. The key to El Patron's downfall rested on one thing: complete and total control. The question was no longer whether he could bring the empire down, but whether he could do it without losing everything. One wrong move, and he wouldn't just be an enemy to El Patron. He would be a dead man. Marco's plan had always been methodical, calculated. He didn't trust anyone fully, not even his closest allies. Trust was a luxury in a world built on lies, and Marco had learned that the hard way. He had spent months ensuring that no one could trace his hand in what was about to unfold. But even with all the pieces in place, doubts gnawed at him. What if one of his trusted men betrayed him? What if El Patron had already caught wind of the plot? The network of informants he'd carefully cultivated was extensive, But it only took one loose thread to unravel everything. As he paced the room, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. A figure stepped in, one of his most loyal men. His eyes were steady, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. "We've got a problem. The leak. It's bigger than we thought." Marco's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment everything could fall apart. But he wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when they were so close. But here's where things get even darker. In a shocking turn of events, the very system that protected El Patrón began to unravel. Reports of corruption within the prison staff started surfacing. An inside job. Guards on El Patrón's payroll were smuggling in weapons, drugs, and even luxury items for his personal use. The prison warden, once his ally, was now being blackmailed. And then came the game changer. One evening, a new inmate arrived. His name? Javier Moreno, a man with nothing to lose, and a brutal secret. He was sent in undercover, a mole planted by the government's most powerful agency. Javier knew he had to play his cards carefully. He couldn't just take down El Patrón, not yet. First, he needed to gather intel. But what he didn't know? El Patrón had eyes everywhere, even within the walls of the prison itself. Javier's first move was subtle. He befriended the guards, bribed the right people, and started to dig into El Patrón's operations. But then, one night, he made the fatal mistake. He trusted the wrong person. El Patrón's spies are not just inside the prison. They're in plain sight. The guards, the inmates, they all work for him. And when Javier made that fatal error, the walls closed in faster than he could react. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. What followed was a brutal game of cat and mouse. Javier was captured, tortured, and forced to confess his mission. But he didn't break. Not at first. Not until he learned the truth that would shake him to his core. You see, El Patrón had a secret weapon, a web of blackmail that extended far beyond the prison walls. He had dirt on judges, politicians, even police officers. The government couldn't touch him. No one could. And now Javier realized that the battle for justice might not be one he could win. Not from inside this fortress. Days turned into weeks, and the prison's power dynamics shifted as El Patrón continued to tighten his grip. With the mole, Javier, exposed and neutralized, his plans to bring down El Patrón seemed to be slipping through his fingers. However, El Patrón's empire wasn't as invincible as he thought. His enemies, although fractured, were still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. A new player entered the scene, El Patrón's own right-hand man, Victor Salazar. Salazar had been with him for years, a trusted enforcer, and a man whose loyalty was unmatched. But as the years passed, cracks began to show in his allegiance. He had his own family in the outside world, and the mounting pressure from both El Patrón's enemies and his own conscience was starting to break him down. Victor started to question his role in the operation. He knew that while El Patrón ruled with an iron fist, it was only a matter of time before someone stronger, smarter, or more ruthless would come for him. His conscience began to gnaw at him. His daughter was growing up without a father figure. His wife? The constant fear that one day El Patrón's enemies would target them? It was eating him alive. As the whispers of betrayal grew louder within the prison walls, Victor made a fateful decision. He began secretly communicating with El Patrón's rivals on the outside. At first, it was small, almost insignificant acts, passing along minor information about shipments or weaknesses in the prison's security systems. But over time, these acts of defiance grew bolder. Salazar's secret meetings, always held under the cover of darkness, soon took a deadly turn. One night, in the solitary confinement wing, he met with a figure he had never seen before. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but his voice was cold, deliberate. He introduced himself only as El Sombra. the Shadow. El Sombra had ties to a cartel far more powerful than any the authorities knew about. The cartel had its own plans for the future of the region, and El Patrón had become an obstacle. For years, his empire had been building, slowly pushing El Patrón's influence into dangerous territory, and now they were ready to strike. Victor was offered a deal: destroy El Patrón from the inside, and in return his family would be safe, his past forgiven, and he would rise to power in a new regime. El Patrón would fall, and the future would be his to mold. At first, Victor hesitated. He had sworn his loyalty to El Patrón, but the weight of his family's safety and his growing hatred for the man he had once considered a brother made him waver. The turning point came when El Patrón ordered an assault on an entire family in the nearby town, one that had crossed him in a business deal. He had them killed without a second thought, a reminder to anyone who dared defy him. Victor watched from the shadows as the life of a young girl was extinguished, and it broke something inside him. He could no longer stand by and let this man destroy everything in his wake. Victor was ready to make his move. But as he plotted his next steps, he didn't realize just how deeply El Patrón had woven his influence into every corner of the prison. Every move he made was being watched. Every whisper he shared with El Sombra was being listened to. In his arrogance, he believed he had more control than he actually did. What he didn't know was that El Patrón had already suspected a betrayal. He had eyes everywhere, and he was always one step ahead. Victor's downfall was swift and brutal. A carefully orchestrated trap ensnared him, and in the dead of night, El Patrón had him dragged from his cell. The man who had once been his closest ally was now at his mercy. As Victor lay in chains, El Patrón stood over him, his cold eyes burning with contempt. "You thought you could betray me," El Patrón said, his voice like ice. "But you forgot one thing. Loyalty is earned, and it can be taken away just as easily." Victor's fate was sealed. The man who had once been his brother in arms was now a casualty in a game of power, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. The tension in the air was palpable, and El Patrón's grip on the prison seemed as unshakable as ever. Yet, even as he ruthlessly crushed his enemies one by one, cracks were beginning to form. El Patrón had always ruled with fear, but fear, as he was starting to realize, was a double-edged sword. While it kept his subordinates in line, it also made them resentful. And in a place like this, a place built on power and survival, loyalty was always temporary. Despite Victor's downfall, there was still a glimmer of hope among those who had been wronged by El Patrón. His empire might have seemed unbreakable from the outside, but inside the walls were closing in. The betrayal had started a ripple effect. The men in the lower ranks, the ones who had been used as pawns for years, began to grow bolder. They whispered to each other in the dead of night, finding solidarity in their shared disdain for their captor. Among them was a man named Marco Alvarez. Marco was a quiet, calculating figure, someone who had never drawn attention to himself. But unlike the rest, Marco had spent years observing El Patrón's every move, studying his weaknesses, understanding the psychological games he played. He knew that power wasn't just about brute strength or fear. It was about influence, manipulation, and timing. Marco was no fool. He had seen El Patrón's empire rise, but now he saw its inevitable fall. Marco's plan was methodical. He knew that the only way to truly take down El Patrón was not to confront him head-on, but to dismantle his empire piece by piece. It had to be subtle. It had to be precise. So Marco started small. He began by gathering a group of trusted men, individuals who, like him, had suffered under El Patrón's rule, but had been biding their time, waiting for the right moment to act. Marco's first move was to exploit El Patrón's paranoia. The man was always watching, always listening, but his obsession with control made him blind to the smallest details. Marco knew that El Patrón relied heavily on his network of informants, spies who operated in the shadows. But there was a flaw. Not all of them were loyal. In fact, Marco had already discovered a few of El Patrón's informants who were secretly working for rival factions, including some of the same groups that Victor Salazar had reached out to. Through subtle manipulation and clever information gathering, Marco was able to turn these spies into double agents. They fed El Patrón misinformation, sowing confusion and uncertainty within his ranks. One by one, the pieces of his empire started to shift out of place. But Marco knew that El Patrón wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was also a survivor. The man had been at the top for so long, it was impossible to think he hadn't learned how to protect himself. El Patrón had eyes everywhere, and Marco couldn't afford to underestimate him. So his next move was far riskier. He decided to create a diversion, something to distract El Patrón long enough to further weaken his power base. The plan was set into motion when Marco orchestrated a series of attacks on El Patrón's most trusted lieutenants. It started with a surprise ambush on a convoy transporting weapons from one of El Patrón's secret warehouses. The attack was swift, efficient, and most importantly, it was designed to send a message. The shipment was lost, and with it, a significant portion of El Patrón's arms supply. When El Patrón's men returned to report the incident, they found that someone had taken control of the warehouse, and it wasn't just rival criminals. A new faction had emerged, one that was organized, methodical, and clearly prepared. The attack, though costly for El Patrón in terms of resources, was a signal that there were forces out there who were ready to challenge him. As the days passed, more and more of El Patrón's operations were undermined. His connections with local authorities weakened as police forces were infiltrated by Marco's men, and rumors began to spread about an internal coup. Each action taken by Marco and his group sent shockwaves through El Patrón's empire, creating a web of doubt and fear. But as his world began to crumble, El Patrón didn't retreat. Instead, he went into full survival mode. He knew the enemy was within his own ranks, and his response was ruthless. Every man, every woman, every soldier in his employ was put under suspicion. Torture, manipulation, and psychological warfare became his weapons. He began rounding up anyone he suspected of disloyalty, demanding answers, extracting confessions, nearly or fabricated, and making an example out of them. It was his way of reasserting control, but it was also a sign of desperation. The clock was ticking. Marco's plan was working, but the tension was mounting. El Patrón had never been one to go down quietly, and Marco knew that this was far from over. The final confrontation was drawing nearer, but the question remained, who would emerge victorious in the end? Would Marco's careful manipulation be enough to topple the empire? Or would El Patrón prove that the roots of his power ran deeper than anyone could imagine? The answers would soon be revealed, but one thing was certain. The prison walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before someone would have to pay the ultimate price. The chaos within El Patrón's prison empire was undeniable. As Marco's plan unfolded, the cracks within El Patrón's control deepened. But El Patrón, the ruthless mastermind he was, wasn't a man who would quietly allow his empire to disintegrate. His countermeasures were swift and brutal, aiming to snuff out any hint of rebellion before it could take root. It was a cat-and-mouse game, but the stakes were higher than ever before. The fortress of power El Patrón had spent years building was crumbling around him, and he was willing to do anything to hold on. The final act of Marco's scheme came with a series of calculated moves designed to dismantle the last vestiges of El Patrón's authority. Marco's agents infiltrated key positions within the prison. They were on the inside, planted so deeply that their betrayal would be nearly impossible to detect. For weeks, Marco fed information to El Patrón's inner circle, but it was never enough to give him the full picture. Each report was tailored to create mistrust, every piece of intelligence designed to keep El Patrón second-guessing his every move. In the meantime, Marco's group secretly began sowing the seeds of discontent among El Patrón's most trusted men. They targeted those who had grown complacent, those who believed they were safe from the bloodbath that had become routine. Marco knew that the fear of retribution would keep the weaker men loyal, but fear could only control someone for so long. Eventually, everyone cracked under pressure, and Marco's recruits were no exception. Slowly, he managed to turn El Patrón's own lieutenants against him, making them question their loyalty and, above all, their survival. But despite the increasing cracks in his empire, El Patrón was far from finished. One fateful night, Marco's agents made their move, infiltrating a meeting with El Patrón's top lieutenants. It was supposed to be a turning point, a moment when they would strike decisively. But in that meeting, something unexpected happened. El Patrón had already anticipated a betrayal. His instincts had never failed him before, and in the past few weeks he had grown increasingly paranoid. He had learned to trust no one, not even his most trusted men. As the meeting unfolded, El Patrón stood up, his cold eyes scanning the room with a calculated intensity. It was as if he had already seen this moment coming. Without warning, he made his move. The door to the room burst open, and heavily armed guards stormed in, weapons drawn. Marco's agents were caught off guard, and before they could react, they were surrounded and subdued. El Patrón had set a trap, and Marco had walked right into it. For a moment, the air hung thick with tension as the scene unfolded. Marco's plan had faltered at the most crucial point. But Marco wasn't easily defeated. He knew that a direct confrontation would only end in his death. Instead, he did what he did best. He pivoted. With calm precision, Marco immediately began to manipulate the situation, trying to shift the balance back in his favor. He played on the fear and doubt that had begun to fester in El Patrón's ranks. "You think this is over?" Marco sneered, though his words were more to manipulate those around him than to threaten El Patrón. "You think you can control all of this with your lies and bloodshed? The walls are closing in on you, Patrón. You're outnumbered. Your empire will fall, no matter what you do." El Patrón stood motionless, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, Marco could see something in El Patrón's gaze, something beyond the cold exterior. It was the look of a man who knew he was losing control, but couldn't fathom the idea of surrender. El Patrón's pride was too strong, his fear too deeply buried. But Marco's words, though provocative, didn't fall on deaf ears. His attack on El Patrón wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He had planted seeds of doubt, forcing El Patrón to confront the truth. His empire was no longer invincible. The men who had followed him for so long were beginning to see that there were cracks in the foundation, and sooner or later, the empire would collapse under its own weight. Yet, in a moment of defiance, El Patrón took control of the room. He barked orders to his men, tightening his grip on the situation. In a swift motion, he ordered the immediate execution of Marco's agents, making it clear that anyone who challenged him would meet a violent end. He wasn't going down without a fight. The man was a predator. His survival instincts were unmatched, and no matter how much the walls closed in on him, he would claw his way to the top if given the chance. But Marco's agents had already set the stage for something much bigger. The prison walls themselves had become the battleground, and Marco had done what he set out to do. He had forced El Patrón to reveal his desperation. The cracks in the empire were no longer just rumors. They were real, and the world beyond the prison walls was beginning to notice. As El Patrón ordered his men to round up those suspected of disloyalty, Marco's message was clear. The time for retribution had arrived, but this wasn't the end. No, this was only the beginning. The groundwork had been laid, and it was only a matter of time before El Patron's empire came crashing down. Marco had one final play to make. With his agents in place, with the men and women he had carefully manipulated in positions of power, the final battle was about to unfold. A battle that would take everything El Patron had to give, and might cost him everything in the end. The aftermath of the failed ambush was swift and brutal. Marco's agents had been eliminated, their bodies left as a grim reminder of what happened to those who crossed El Patron. But what El Patron didn't see coming was the magnitude of the storm he had just stirred. His empire, built on fear and control, was unraveling in ways that even he couldn't fully comprehend. The repercussions of the failed ambush weren't just felt within the walls of the prison. They reverberated through the entire network of alliances, businesses, and corrupt officials El Patron had carefully cultivated over the years. In a move that many considered reckless, El Patron had not only revealed his paranoia, but had exposed the depth of his weakness. To the outside world, the show of power looked like the desperation of a man fighting to hold on to the last threads of his crumbling empire. Inside the prison, the atmosphere grew even more volatile. Those who had once been loyal to El Patron began to whisper among themselves, unsure of whether their survival was guaranteed. The loyalty that had been painstakingly nurtured was now shaken to its core. The chains of fear, once firm, had begun to rust. The prison that had been a fortress now seemed more like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right spark to set it off. Marco had been playing a long game, and he knew that this moment of chaos, this uncertainty, was the key to his ultimate success. His agents may have been wiped out, but their deaths weren't in vain. Each one of them had played a role in planting doubt in El Patron's mind, and now, more than ever, that doubt was consuming him. Marco knew that if he wanted to win, he had to strike at El Patron's weakest point, the fear that he wasn't invincible anymore. In the weeks that followed the failed ambush, Marco's strategy shifted. It wasn't enough to just sow distrust within the prison. He needed to widen the cracks. He worked from the shadows, sending out subtle messages to key people in the outside world, people who were tied to El Patron's business interests, his network of corrupt politicians, and even law enforcement officials. It wasn't just about the prison anymore. It was about bringing El Patron down in every way possible, from every angle. The very system that had propped him up was beginning to buckle under the weight of his paranoia and Marco's relentless pursuit of his downfall. Marco's next move was brilliant in its simplicity. He fed information about El Patron's operations to rival criminal organizations. He knew they had been eyeing El Patron's territory for years, but they had always been too afraid to make a move. Fear of retaliation kept them in check, but Marco gave them the ammunition they needed. He fed them just enough to make them believe that El Patron was no longer as powerful as he once was. And once the rival gangs sensed weakness, the floodgates opened. The gang wars that followed were brutal, but the most important outcome was clear. El Patron's empire was under siege on all fronts, and the cracks in his foundation were rapidly expanding. But while Marco had orchestrated the chaos, he couldn't afford to let El Patron's desperation consume him completely. He knew that El Patron was a man who never gave up without a fight. As the rival gangs attacked and the whispers of betrayal grew louder, El Patron began to fight back with everything he had. His power was slipping, but his survival instincts were still sharp. He launched a counter-offensive that left no room for hesitation. In a matter of days, El Patron sent his forces out to crush the rival gangs with overwhelming force. His methods were as ruthless as ever, destroying everything and everyone who stood in his way. His men hit the streets, decimating anyone who was perceived as a threat. But this aggressive retaliation was a double-edged sword. While it temporarily stabilized his empire, it only heightened the sense of vulnerability among those who had been supporting him, particularly those closest to him. At the same time, Marco had been laying the groundwork for his next major move. He wasn't just relying on external chaos, he needed to strike from within. He reached out to the men who had once served under El Patrón, men who were no longer loyal but were still afraid. These men were the final piece of the puzzle, and Marco was determined to turn them into his allies. He fed them information, played on their fears, and slowly began to pull them into his fold. These men, once loyal to the core, were now questioning El Patrón's ability to protect them, to keep them alive. They had seen the cracks, and they were ready to abandon ship. The final piece of Marco's plan fell into place when he arranged a covert meeting with several key figures from within El Patrón's inner circle. These were men who had long been kept in check by fear and loyalty, but now, in the face of escalating violence and the fear of being caught in El Patrón's inevitable downfall, they were ready to listen. Marco knew that if he could get them to defect, he would have the power to dismantle El Patrón from the inside. It was a delicate operation. If even one of them betrayed him, it would all be over. But Marco was confident. He had been playing the long game for years, and now, with El Patrón's empire in freefall, it was time to close in for the kill. At the meeting, Marco made his pitch, appealing to their desire for survival and power. "You've seen what's happening," Marco said. "El Patrón can't protect you. His empire is crumbling. But we can build something better, something stronger. It's time to break away from the wreckage before it's too late." The offer was irresistible. One by one they agreed, and Marco had successfully infiltrated the last bastion of El Patrón's empire. His position was now stronger than ever. The final phase of the operation was set in motion. With Marco's network now deeply embedded in the heart of El Patrón's operation, the final phase of his plan was set in motion. The pieces were all in place, and the tension in the air was palpable. Marco knew that the fall of El Patrón would not come without its bloodshed, but this was the final act of a carefully orchestrated play. The timing had to be flawless, the execution perfect. The first move was subtle yet powerful. Marco's allies in El Patrón's inner circle began to leak vital intelligence about the Empire's most sensitive operations. It wasn't enough to simply inform Marco about the weaknesses. He needed that information to circulate outside the prison walls, to destabilize El Patrón's allies and strip away his support system. The cracks in the foundation of El Patrón's empire grew wider with every passing day. Secret accounts were exposed, shady dealings were brought to light, and corruption that had once been hidden from public view now bubbled to the surface like toxic waste. The public outcry was deafening. Investigations were launched into El Patrón's legitimate businesses, while police and government officials who had once been in his pocket suddenly found themselves facing pressure from above. The media caught wind of the scandal and began to paint El Patrón as a man who had built his empire on blood and betrayal, not just within the criminal world, but within the very institutions meant to uphold law and order. The sense of invincibility that El Patrón had carefully cultivated for decades was beginning to shatter, piece by piece. Meanwhile, in the prison, the atmosphere was nothing short of a powder keg. The inmates who had once been loyal to El Patrón now saw the man they had supported for so long as weak, vulnerable, and out of control. Rumors began to circulate. Some said that El Patrón had lost his grip on reality. Others whispered that he had become paranoid to the point of madness. But no matter what they believed, the common denominator was clear. El Patrón's reign was over, and they could either side with him and face the collapse of his empire, or they could throw their lot in with Marco, who was poised to take control. Marco's agents, now positioned within the prison and the wider criminal network, began to move with increasing boldness. They weren't just providing information anymore. They were strategically sabotaging El Patrón's operations from within. Key shipments of contraband disappeared into thin air. Rivals and enemies who had long been silenced suddenly found their voices, and alliances that had once been unbreakable began to fracture. But Marco knew that El Patron was no fool. The old kingpin wasn't going to simply sit back and allow his empire to fall apart without a fight. His counterattacks were swift and brutal. He began to purge his ranks, executing anyone he suspected of disloyalty, making his paranoia even more evident to those around him. His operations, once sleek and efficient, began to fall into disarray as El Patron tried to retain control through fear and violence alone. But violence, as Marco had learned, was a two-edged sword. It worked to maintain power in the short term, but it alienated allies and scared off potential supporters. As El Patron cracked down on anyone suspected of betrayal, he inadvertently accelerated his own downfall. The very people who might have been convinced to stick with him in exchange for power, money, or protection began to see that El Patron's regime had become a sinking ship. The more he lashed out, the more he pushed people into Marco's arms. The key to Marco's success had always been patience, and now, as his network inside the prison and in the outside world tightened like a vice, he prepared for the final confrontation. He knew that the moment had to be right and that no mistakes could be made. A single misstep now would undo everything. The time came when El Patron made a desperate move. He tried to consolidate his remaining forces in a bid for one final stand. He called in reinforcements from outside the prison, mobilizing his last loyal soldiers to take back control of the prison and suppress the growing rebellion. But Marco was always one step ahead. In the dead of night, when most of El Patron's men were spread thin, Marco and his allies made their move.